I'm Nancy Zieman. Welcome to Sewing with Nancy. Well, maybe I should change that to Serging with Nancy and Gail. Gail Brown, co-author of the Ultimate Serger Answer Guide, is my special guest on this three-part series based on her book. Gail, welcome back to Sewing with Nancy.
Thanks, Nancy. I'm really looking forward to sharing the quick fixes and tips for common serging problems.
As many of you know, a serger or overlock machine stitches a seam, overlocks and trims off the excess seam allowances in one step. In this first program, Gail and I will guide you through some of the easiest and best solutions when working with the basic overlock stitch. That's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's how-to sewing program with Nancy Zieman, is brought to you by PFAFF, the largest European producer of sewing machines. PFAFF's creative line of sewing machines and hobby-lock sergers are simply the best. Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears for home, classroom, and industry. Ginger scissors and shears are the choice of professionals. Oxmoor House, the publisher of fine sewing, quilting, and craft books, including Nancy's books and the Sew for Fun collection So Easy, Sew Now. Madeira thread from Germany with superior quality and smart packaging to make it a sensational value, preferred by home and professional embroiderers everywhere. And by Nancy's Notions catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and unique, hard-to-find sewing notions and supplies.
As I mentioned, this program is the Ultimate Serger Answer Guide. And if we have answers, Gail, first we have to have questions. So I'm going to pose some questions, and then Gail and I are going to go through giving you the solutions when working with serging. First of all, many people say, I can't get the tensions balanced.
Nancy, before we even get into how to adjust our tensions, maybe we should say, why is it important?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's real simple. They're stronger, more uniform, and better for ravel proofing when you have balanced tensions.
You know, the best way to see this is to look at a sample that has balanced tensions and then unbalanced tensions.
As you can see on the sample on the left, with balanced tensions, the upper looper, the yellow thread, and the lower looper, the red thread, interlock at the edge. The needle thread should look like straight stitching on the top side and tiny loops on the underside. The other samples to the right are irregular. Loopy threads indicate that the tension should be tightened. To expose more thread, loosen the tension.
It's a real good example, and what we're going to do to help tell you which tensions should be tightened or loosened is to use color-coded thread in our sergers.
This is a great way to identify which tension to adjust. And Nancy, I'm going to show, this is my left needle, the one you'd use for most seaming, and that's my blue thread here. Then I move to my upper looper in the pink, and that's goes over the top of the fabric. And on the underside is my lower looper in the yellow. And these give you an idea of which tension to adjust. So if I saw loopy threads on my lower looper, that's the one that I would adjust, that dial. Other things affect the tensions, Nancy, when you, besides the dials, and one thing are the threading paths, and you have to make sure to follow your manual and the instructions inside to make sure you go through all the eyes and guides. Make sure your telescopic thread guide is fully extended, that you've used spool caps so that your thread feeds smoothly and doesn't get caught on the spool notch. And this gives you an idea. The other thing is to make sure that you're following the threading order that is right for your machine.
I think that's what happens to me sometimes. The thread snaps out of the tension or comes out of the tension disc.
Start with good quality thread too, Nancy. That'll solve a lot of problems.
We showed you some samples with balanced stitches, and I have the same setting, the color coding on my machine, only I have two needles, a left and right needle on my machine. And I have medium weight fabric, and it's balanced. Notice the pink on the top, the yellow on the bottom are interlocking at the side seam. And you may think, this is all we need to do, except when you change fabrics. The same settings with different fabric on lightweight fabric produce loops. You can see along the edge, it's very loopy. The lighter weight the fabric, the tighter the tensions for the loopers. The reverse applies. This is a polar fleece fabric where I have, again, that same setting, but I have to loosen the tensions because on the underside, that upper looper has wrapped around the edge. One key to keep in mind is that with thick fabrics, loosen tensions, especially the looper tensions. Lightweight fabric, a little bit tighten the tensions, but always test.
And Nancy, the tension, tightening, and loosening direction varies from model to model.
Great hint. Now I'm on the very bulky fabric, so I'm slightly going to give this a loosened by 1 notch or number. And I find that's where, let me loosen it just a little bit more. Always run a sample or two before you serge.
And so what we're saying, Nancy, is as you change from project to project, you're going to change your tensions.
Right. Tension is especially important when the serging is decorative, such as on this shawl collar jacket created by Linda Lee. Because the fabric is thick, she loosened the looper threads. To unify the design, notice the collar appliques that were finished with the same stitch. Really lovely. We have another type of tension indicator, and that is the length of the stitch, Gail.
And Nancy, show the sample. It's just fascinating how it changes and how stitch length affects your tension.
Pretty normal stitch length right here, and as we move, it's getting closer together, we flip this to the underside, and you can see that that thread is really loopy. So that's an indicator too.
So as we're going to tighten as we shorten our stitch, the looper tensions.
And the reverse for lengthening the stitch.
So we loosen as we lengthen the stitch.
So if you can keep these things in mind, it's going to make our serging quite a bit easier. You know, we have another problem, that is sometimes the seams spread.
The stitch sample on the left shows the problem, the seam spreading, revealing the thread ladder in the seam line. Nancy will show the very simple solutions to close the seam line.
On my serger, I have it set up for 4 threads, and the only difference between my serger and Gail's is that I have 2 needles in my machine. Here's a close-up of how your machine may look when it's set up for 4-thread serging. That's one way to solve the problem of having the seams spread and get the loopers to show through that area. You can see, or excuse me, the needle threads to show. But some of the ways to solve that problem will be to use a stronger, tighter thread in the needle, nylon thread.
And nylon thread like monofilament that you're showing, Nancy, or I use woolly nylon quite a bit too. And the reason these tighten the seam line is because as they're feeding through the machine, they tighten, enhancing the tightening that your machine can do with its dials.
So with nylon thread, we like to use those in the needles when you need stress-proof seaming.
Right, and use it in your left needle if you have a 3/4 thread.
And you know, Gail, one quick other thing to mention about the stress of the seam. Serger seams do not have the strength of a conventionally sewn seam.
No, because there's no bobbin.
And those are some great answers for seamings that have stress to them. Gail and I would now like to show you some of the common ways of using these 3- and 4-thread stitches now that you know how to get perfect tension, seams that are not under stress. I just finished talking about working with the woolly nylon or nylon fabric in the needle areas. And that applies also to working with swimwear or lycra blended fabrics for activewear. On this swimsuit sample, you can see that the seam has to have great stretch in both the length and the crosswise direction.
And so you've used woolly nylon in all positions
Yes.
for that seam, correct?
For all of them. And not just the needle as we did for a seam under stress. And you can see why, because this thread has as much stretch as the activewear or swimwear.
And it's comfortable next to the skin too.
And sometimes we even use 4 threads. When I first started serging, it was just 3 threads for activewear, but for durability, if you have the stretch, 4 threads work.
And remember, when you're using the woolly nylon in the loopers, you're going to want to loosen the
right.
tensions just a little bit because it tightens as it passes through the
Yes,
machine.
the thread tightens as it goes through the tension. So a test sample is always important for serging.
Before fast professional serge finishing, seams and facings were tediously Hong Kong finished, as shown on this tweed jacket. Now seams and facings can be trimmed and ravel proofed in one step, as seen on this hot pink unlined jacket.
I use seam finishings quite commonly on my serger, probably like warming coffee in your microwave. But we sometimes recommend a 3-thread, 3 threads for finishing the seams.
Only if I have a very ravelly fabric do I use a 3/4 thread stitch for finishing.
Because that extra thread adds more bulk. So that's a very common way of using our sergers. And now I'd like to show you this charming patchwork dress, which was pieced using serging, which streamlines the patchwork and minimizes bulk, while eliminating the need for lining and ensuring durability through wearing and washing. Now, not everyone thinks of a serger with patchwork or with quilting, but I think if my grandmother had a serger, she would have used it for making her quilts, don't you?
I think she would have too, and one of the reasons is you don't have to line the project.
So for wearable art, wearable quilted art, this is a perfect way of fast seaming and clean finishing the edges. Obviously, this is not the fabric used in the adorable dress, but just as an example, we would serge strips together and then press the seam allowances in one direction, and then cut the strips into the desired size. Now notice when we put the matching strips together, we'll meet right sides together, we're going to have seams that go in the opposite direction. I'll show you the side view. One of the reasons for stacking those seams in opposite directions is to eliminate bulk. But to easily serge this, Gail, one of my suggestions is, let me get it right here, is to serge with the seam that is pressed upward on the top. So you're looking at this piece. Let me match this side. And the reason for this is you can guide this. You can make certain that that seam is going in the right direction. Let me show you how. As I'm serging this, obviously this bottom layer will have the seam going in the correct direction. But the top layer, notice the seam is going upward. But to keep it in that right direction, I'm simply going to use a little screwdriver, a stiletto, a pin, whatever you'd like. So as it gets near the foot, notice how it rides underneath the foot, and you can keep on serging. And then as I get to my next piece, simple quilting techniques, only this time serging quilting techniques. As I get to my next piece, I just chain it into place. Make sure that seam is going under the presser foot and keep on going.
So you're using your serge seaming not only to seam but to organize your assembly.
Correct. And this seaming, stacking of the seam technique also works well on garment sewing for bulky seams to stagger the widths.
I alternate, especially on knits where the seams are a little bulkier.
You know, we have another problem we'd like to solve, and that's the difficulty of matching stripes or plaits.
There's a real easy, quick way to do this, and what I've done, Nancy, is I've offset my underlayer. I have right sides together about 1/8 of an inch, and this shouldn't affect your fit.
Right.
And then I'm just going to serge, and do you see how when I serge, I can actually watch the matching. There's no guesswork, and best yet, no pins. And if you don't want to run into pins with your serger knives, you don't have to.
Great. And then if you serge, you're going to have to sometimes rip. And
Always.
Right. So our next problem we'd like to solve are easy ways to get out the 3 or 4 threads of a seam.
Here I have a 3/4 thread serge seam, and I might add that this is medium to long length, which are a little bit easier to rip. And all I do, Nancy, is pull my needle threads evenly, and I want to show you the magic of this. Your looper threads just fall off.
Like the old-fashioned flower bags.
Yes.
Once you got the right thread, you were in business.
Well, it is a knitting process, and that's why it does it.
Or if you have a seam ripper or a surgical seam ripper, this is a 4-thread stitch, so a little bit more secure. I'm just going to guide the blade along the very edge, cutting all these threads. Notice how quickly that goes. And then as I open this up, it opens very easily, and then just give it a little extra guidance as you're pulling it, and you'll have your seam out. So I hope you'll try some of these ideas when you must take out some of your serger stitches. Another common serging problem is having excessive stretching at the serged edge. The top sample illustrates this dilemma. The 3 remaining samples show us that the solutions are easy, including lengthening the stitch, using differential feed, or stabilizing the under edge with clear elastic. Let me show you how. Gail is taking a little break while I'm going to show you this next segment. And to solve the problem of the edge waving, especially on crosswise edges, simply lengthen the stitch. You can see the density change in the stitches, a really simple solution. The clear elastic is another great example to use on knits. On shoulder seams or crosswise seams, just serge the elastic right in the seam, and it has great stretchability. I really like that way of stabilizing the seam. I told you about differential feed, kind of a funny term for sewing, but we have kind of a lot of those in our vocabulary. And the feed dogs bite the fabric and feed it through. This is the normal setting. If I plus it, notice a change in the feed dogs, how it takes more fabric or less in the opposite direction. We're going to utilize that in many ways of serging just by changing how much fabric is placed through the machine. Now the next question, how do you utilize a differential feed? These samples show the contrast between ugly and attractive curves. You'll soon see that by tightening the differential feed, you'll be able to maneuver around curves easily with attractive stitches. That curve is great for pocket corners. This is a patch pocket, and you can see on this corner that as I got to the curve area, we simply tightened the setting and it just eased in the fullness. It will also work on setting in ease sleeves. I'm going to tighten my differential feed and place just maybe I'll widen also the bite, widen the stitch. And as I serge around the edge, just trimming off just a little of the fabric, it will ease the sleeve. You'll do a test. I always like to do a test sample. I'm just through this area and I'll just serge off. But it's kind of remarkable how that eases into place. Now I would set this sleeve in with my conventional machine, but notice how easily that worked just by tightening the differential feed. So around curves, or if you have wavy areas, these are some areas that you can utilize the specialty settings at your machine by using the differential feed, or by lengthening the stitch, or even using clear elastic to get rid of the wavy edges or to add wavy edges where you need them. Here's another way to make the most use out of the differential feed setting on your serger. Serge on ruffles, combining a shirring foot and specific serger settings. This adorable dress, serged and stitched with a watermelon theme, would be a welcome addition to any little girl's wardrobe. Here's how to add the ruffles. During the break, I placed on a shirring foot. The shirring foot has an interesting lower layer that allows me to feed in two pieces of fabric at one time, but at different rates. The bottom layer is going to gather, that layer that's put in the insert is not. When working with ruffles, do a sample. And I like to usually cut the ruffle at a 2-to-1 ratio, double the length of the stabilized fabric. With right side up, this longer layer is going to be placed under kind of that tongue-looking type of appendage, and then with right sides meeting, the stabilized layer is going to go into the slot. This is probably the most amazing thing about serging, because what's going to happen now, because I have the differential feed at the tightest setting, this lower layer is going to gather. The top layer is going to be remaining stabilized. I've also lengthened the stitch, and I simply am working with an overlock stitch and just serge along the edge and try to feed them at the same area. And when you see this, it wasn't quite a 2-to-1 ratio, but fairly close, just a little bit extra in length. But when I flip this to the right side, let me show you how interestingly this gathered and how evenly. So when you're adding a lot of ruffles for home decorating projects, for little girls' dresses, this is the way to work with it, with a differential feed and the shirring foot. Once again, we sometimes think of serging as a functional operation. Well, here it's functional as well as very decorative, and I hope you'll give it a try. I hope that Gail and I have given you some ideas and solutions of working with that basic overlock stitch on your serger. I just finished working with the shirring foot and the differential feed. We have a single layer of fabric here that's finished with a rolled edge. We'll give you those hints next, but I want to also point out that on this top sample we used a double layer of fabric. We used the ruffle folded in half, and that worked equally as well through the shirring foot. A great serging solution. I hope you'll give it a try. I would like to talk about one of the fine underwriters of Sewing with Nancy. I'm sure you've noticed I use PFAFF sewing machines and sergers exclusively on my television show and videotapes, and there's a good reason for it. PFAFF machines provide the reliable performance I need, and they're very easy to use. What's more, PFAFF stitch quality is exceptional. So whether I'm using a PFAFF creative model for elaborate fashion sewing or a high-tech serger for home dec work, I know I can count on my PFAFF to help me do my very best sewing every time. And so can you. Your local PFAFF dealer is there to help and can show you the entire PFAFF line. New from Oxmoor House, the Sew for Fun collection, So Easy, Sew Now. Quick ways to sew gifts, accessories, clothing, and more. Order now. You'll receive free 7 project cards, a pattern sheet, binder and dividers, and my new monthly newsletter. You'll also receive more project cards to preview for 30 days. No obligation. If you decide to keep them, we'll bill you only $5.98 plus shipping and handling. Then about once a month, you'll receive 2 new sets of projects in my free newsletter at the same low price. Keep only shipments you want, cancel anytime. Call 1-800-765-6400 and So Easy, Sew Now. Thanks for joining me and welcome to Sewing with Nancy. This is the second program of our 3-part series entitled The Ultimate Serger Answer Guide. Once again, Gail Brown, nationally known serging and sewing expert, takes time out of her busy writing schedule to share her serging expertise. Gail, thanks for joining us.
Nancy, it's great to be back. Today I'd like to share with our viewers some of the interesting variations on the basic serge stitch, the narrow rolled edge and the flatlock stitch. We'll also feature some of the notions, machine adjustments, threads that you need to guarantee success.
We'll start with the rolled edge, a narrow stitch that's both decorative and functional. It's frequently used to finish scarves, napkins, and lightweight fabrics. That's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy. The narrow rolled edge is perfect for quick, lightweight, but durable finishing of scarves and napkins, as these great samples show. Now, Gail, the quick setup for a rolled edge is as follows.
First of all, let's talk about thread, Nancy. And I've used woolly nylon in all positions of this 3-thread narrow rolled edge. I used it for the needle and the lower looper because they want to be tightened down. You barely want to see those, and the tightening action of the woolly nylon makes that happen.
Because it stretches.
Yes, and then we use it in our upper looper because it covers the edge so beautifully. The other thing we want to do is use our narrow fingered throat plate and foot. Now on some models, Nancy, you don't have to change at all, maybe one or the other. It varies with the model.
So always check that owner's manual.
Yes. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to change our stitch length to just a hair above the shortest length. I've tightened down my lower looper so we barely see that. I've used my right needle because we want that narrow stitch. And the other thing I've done is that I have narrowed my stitch width. And you'll find that adjustment if you look in your manual. And we are ready to serge. And you've got a beautiful, strong edge.
We've used color-coded threads to the colors on the tension dial so that you could see that the pink, for example, is the most obvious on your rolled edge. That coincides with the upper looper. At home, you'd use cone threads that matched your fabric, of course. Now, this is a Serger Answer Guide series, so we're going to pose some questions and then we'll give you some answers. And with a rolled edge, many times, Gail, people have problems or concerns. They have rolled edge, what we call snafus.
The samples shown here are common rolled edge problems and their solutions. The edge on the top blue fabric isn't rolling, making it too wide. Nancy will demonstrate how to roll and narrow the stitch.
This is a purchased scarf, and it shows a rolled edge that didn't roll. And you can see that the loops are going off the edge. It doesn't roll, it's just flat. And Gail, I think you have a good reason. This doesn't look bad, but why would we want a rolled edge?
It's not as strong. You don't have a double layer of fabric in there, so it's not going to be as durable.
It might pull off, even as we saw in some of our samples. So there are a couple of ways to look at this. And if you're having problems with your edge not rolling, on my machine, to change the width, I have to go inside, and I'm going to make it wider. Actually wider, not narrower. So I widen that a little bit. And then again, make sure you have your right needle in your machine. We have the stretchy type nylon thread in the upper looper. And then consider grain line.
It's so important, Nancy. Show them the camisole where it's inconsistent, and so we don't get even rolling.
You know, we have the curves on this camisole, and sometimes you can't roll every edge. And this is a bad example. You can see the curves, kind of the bias, and it's not rolling. and it's inconsistent. The widths have little hiccups in them, and it just kind of has some troubles. Rolled edge isn't for everything. So if you're working with a scarf, ruffles, napkins, the edge that is the lengthwise of your fabric is the most stable. On this sample, you can see I've started to serge off the selvage so that you know it's the length of the fabric, and that's where you'll have the most stable, consistent grain line of all. So try to work with that when you're doing, if you're having problems with having these not roll properly. And then another solution is an option to use 2 layers of fabric on this scarf. The edge is very beautifully rolled because there are 2 layers put together here. And then that fabric just really wraps around the edge.
Yes, and the 2 layers, I believe, were fused together before they were
Because
rolled.
otherwise lightweight fabric could kind of shift very easily, posing another problem,
Yes.
I guess. Then what if the stitch pulls off, Gail?
Nancy, I have a sample of that right here, and anyone who's serged has faced this one time or another, and it simply pulls off the edge. And to solve this, I do a few things. Number one, try lengthening your stitch length, and you perforate the edge less, and so it has less of a tendency to pull off. Another thing that I do is maybe change to a finer thread in the needle, and that perforates the edge less. I'm using a machine embroidery rayon thread here. Try also changing to a finer needle, and that will make a difference also. And finally, widen your bite, which will roll more fabric under your upper looper and be stronger.
Another couple of solutions for maybe hairy edges where the fabric has whiskers on it. On this sample, the edges are poking out, and that is to serge twice. Go over it with a wider bite to serge 2 times, or use a water-soluble stabilizer and serge over the stabilizer, then remove it, and you'll get rid of those edges. The narrow rolled edge makes an elegant finish for a tailored garment, such as a striped silk jacket. For more uniform stitching, the edges were fused together first using a 1/2 inch wide fusible web, and then serged the edges, removing the seam allowance to create a decorative look. Gail, why don't you show us how you created that jacket?
First thing I did, Nancy, was I used paper-backed fusible web to base my layers together so that I would have a consistent stitch and so that the edges wouldn't slip. Remove the paper, fuse the 2 together, and then I used a fabric marking pencil to mark my seam line so that I'd know where to stitch.
You have wrong sides together the collar. One has interfacing on it. Now you're marking the edge.
Now I'm marking the edge, and then all I do, Nancy, I've got set up for my rolled edge stitch, and I just serge, cutting off the full seam allowance. And a little trick here, and that is if you're having difficulty getting that edge to roll, try going to a balanced stitch if all else fails.
Sure. So it could either be a rolled edge stitch with this exposed edge, or it could be a balanced overlock stitch as we did in the first program. Collars have corners, and so another things that have corners that are perfect for rolled edge are scarves, napkins, and tablecloths. And this is really what I use a rolled edge for quite frequently. But a common problem with rolled edges is at corners you get a dog-eared look. This edge shows kind of a dog-eared, and this is a stitch or an edge corner that has been serged that isn't dog-eared because a little advanced planning was taken into place, and that is when serging, when you get to the corner, rather than serge straight, cant that fabric in a little bit, so you're kind of rounding the corner. As I'm getting to this edge, I'm simply going to cant this just a touch, so that I am not following the straight of grain as I'm serging. And as I hold this up, you'll be kind of surprised. It looks like I'm on the straight of grain, but actually I just curve the fabric just a tiny bit. And then when I start to serge the next edge, and let me pull up my next sample, then after you clip off the threads that have been sealed, you'll get that non-dog-eared effect. You get a square corner even though you tried to round it a little bit.
So the rounder corner looks more square.
That's right. Now for veiling, you have some ideas.
Yes, to trace or outline the edge of this bridal veil, a long, narrow rolled edge was used, and in the upper looper position, a lightweight metallic rayon thread. The rolled edge can also be used for seaming shears, laces, or netting, as seen on the delicate gift bags also shown here.
It's kind of fun to create gift bags from netting or veiling, isn't it?
It is, and with this stitch being so finished looking, it can go inside or outside.
Now the settings and the types of thread that you used are a little bit different than what we've used earlier.
I use lightweight thread, I use metallic, and then the solid color rayon embroidery thread. I kept my stitch length long in my 3-thread rolled edge, and it makes a perfectly lightweight but outlined edge.
Remember, that's the metallic thread in the upper looper, that's the showcase thread, and then the needle thread or the lower looper thread having the solid color.
Yes.
I think lengthening the length of the stitch is so important. I've always kind of had it too short in these instances, and that pulls off. It makes it difficult to serge.
Yes, this will keep it lightweight but strong.
So these are some guidelines in working with this specialty fabric. Our next question that is many times posed is, how can I easily work with wire or beading or perhaps fishing line to serge on the edge? And we have a pretty simple solution. A beading foot can make easy work of bead strand application as seen on this special occasion basket liner. The same beading foot allows safe, fast serging over any dimensional filler like yarn strands, fishing line, or even wire. And Gail's going to show us how to do this next step.
Nancy, for this I have already put my beading foot on the machine, and the reason it works is there's a channel in the back that the beading strand goes under and a channel in the front that it goes through. And I've also put my needle in the left needle position so it will more easily clear the width of the bead strand. And you can't always do this on every machine, so check your manual. Watch as I serge. I have lengthened my stitch so that the stitches fall between the bead strand. And doesn't that go on safely?
Yes, I've done it other ways and haven't had such good results. We're going to show you a sample of the beading on veiling fabric or special occasion fabric. Gail did it on calico so that you could see the contrast, but this is how it would work. Here we'd recommend using a monofilament or nylon thread as the thread in all the positions so that you don't see the thread. You could just see the beauty of the beads. Using that same beading foot that has a channel through it, you can definitely work with other types of fillers. This is a hair bow, and the edges of the rolled edge are more pronounced and predominant because, of all things, fishing line has been fed through the channel and just serged over that, giving it as much bounce and resiliency as the fishing wire has. Gail's third recommendation to use that specialty beading foot, and I know she likes to make bows a lot, and this is fun to work with, but is to use wire. And on these wire-edged bows, the wire-edged bows with metallic thread in the upper looper, she simply guided some wire.
And Nancy, when I use wire, I like to use from 20 to 30 gauge wire, and the smaller the number, the heavier the wire, and the more resilient the edge, and you just feed it through the channels, just like I showed you for beads.
So you can see you have 3 different types of fillers to work with this specialty foot to solve your problem. Next, let's look at the flatlock setting and the interesting decorative stitch capabilities of a serger. This perfectly flatlock top was created by serger expert Linda Lee. She used variegated thread to add interesting details within the fabric. Unlike other serger techniques we've shown you, flatlocking isn't restricted to the edges of the fabric. Let's start with the setup of the serger. Gail will be back at our next program, but right now I'd like to show you how to set up for the flatlock. Do check your owner's manual. These are just some general guidelines, but first of all I'm going to do the 3-thread setup for a flatlock stitch. I'm using all-purpose thread in the needle, and I just have the all-purpose serger thread. And for the needle setting, you're going to have it at no tension at all. I have it at -5 on my machine. Of course, your dials will vary, but tension is very limited here on your thread. There isn't a needle thread, so now we're going to go to the upper looper. Here's the thread that's really going to show. You're going to showcase this thread. I'm using a rayon thread that has a tremendous amount of luster. And you can have it, you can see it here too in another manner. And because it doesn't have a lot of twist, it's perfect for flat locking. For the lower looper, I do have a nylon thread. This really shouldn't show that much. We have it in contrasting threads so that you can see it. Nylon thread, it needs to pull tightly, as we mentioned earlier in this series. Another suggestion would be to use the clear nylon thread. This would probably be my preference if this wasn't a demonstration. So nylon thread in the lower looper, and the setting for that lower looper, you're going to tighten it because you want that thread to pull it so you can see the beauty of the stitch. Speaking of the stitch, let me show you what's going to occur. Like with all serging, we're going to serge on the edge of the fabric, folding the fabric, and I've press marked where I'd like the fold, serge along the edge, and then when you flatten it out, it's called a flatlock after all, and this one has been flattened and pressed. You can see that on the underside you have one look, a ladder stitch, and on the top side you have an interesting decorative stitch within the fabric. That's because we're serging on the fold. Speaking of serging on the fold, you're not going to cut off any fabric. You know the blade areas of sergers. Guide the fabric away from the blades. So rather than having it next to the blade areas you see here, just back it off. Loops will form along the edge as I'm serging. That's the purpose of it. You might have to adjust your tensions, do some little adjusting as you're working at this, but the purpose of guiding it away is that the loops will form off the edge so that as you pull it flat, it lies flat, the stitch lies flat. Now you can see if I didn't have that pink stitch there, it would be a little bit more attractive. And you would use matching blue or the clear nylon thread. That's how to get the flat lock. Now I must admit this isn't quite as flat as I'd like, and that's a problem that many of you may have. So let me give you some guidelines on your test to prevent that from happening. The first is to have no tension at all on that needle thread. It needs to be very loopy. If the tension doesn't work in this area by having it at a negative number, simply pop the thread out of the tension dials, place some tape over the guide area, and then the tension will be eliminated. Another thought would be to slightly tighten the lower looper as well. Testing does wonders when working with flat locking. Now for more ideas using a flat lock, this time along the edge of napkins. These napkins feature 2 decorative threads and a 2-thread flatlock stitch that hasn't been flattened, called a blanket stitch. This is a versatile stitch with great creative possibilities. Not all sergers can be set up for 2-thread serging. Do check your owner's manual, but if you can, this is an excellent way of getting a very flat lock because you have one less thread. But it's also a great way to have decorative stitches. First of all, the settings and the types of thread. A nylon thread works extremely well in the needle, clear thread or the stretchy type nylon, but for the decorative you want something that really has shine and luster or interesting detail. On our napkin we had the gold thread in this metallic rayon combination. Just has 2 threads. Again, follow your instructions for the setup. It'll be different on many machines, but because we're going to use this as a blanket stitch, kind of as the edge, I don't have to fold the fabric, I can just serge along the edge. We'll have 2 different looks to this. Wait till you see, again, a close-up of how this appears. It's kind of interesting. You can see the metallic rayon thread on the top, and then when we flip it around, it looks like a blanket stitch. That's why we called it that. We'll scoot that thread there. But isn't that an interesting effect? You saw this earlier on the napkin edges with the gold metallic and then the green thread having the blanket stitch look. You may also want to consider using this perhaps along a jacket, using the needle thread as the exposed stitch for, again, that true blanket stitch. If you are hesitant about using a flat lock, you can get the same look by using what we call a safe lock stitch, and that is to use an overlock stitch, have the right sides exposed, and then simply stitch it down with a conventional machine to make a fake type of flat lock. In the second program of the Ultimate Serger Answer Guide, Gail Brown and I gave you many details of working with the roll edge, and then I gave you some hints on the flat lock stitch. A quick review on the flat lock. It can be within the fabric, as on this turquoise top, having serging along the fold of the fabric and then flattening it to get that beautiful detailed edge, or you could serge 2 edges together, meeting the wrong side and flattening it out to have a decorative look within once again. These are just 2 interesting ways of using the flat lock. We'll be back. Ginger Incorporated, the manufacturer of the finest quality scissors and shears, has been a sponsor of Sewing with Nancy for more than 10 years. Each article in their complete assortment is manufactured with care and attention to detail, whether cutting, nipping, pinking, clipping, or trimming. There is a Ginger product designed for that job. Join me in thanking Ginger Incorporated for their dedicated sponsorship. Did you know that almost 70% of professional embroiderers use one particular brand of thread? That thread is Madeira. Now, the full line of German-made Madeira threads is available to home sewers as well as professionals. Today's sophisticated home sewing machines demand quality threads. When you use Madeira threads in your machines, they will stitch better and your finished products will look more professional. Madeira produces threads and flosses in hundreds of colors for machine, serger, and hand embroidery. Embroiderers prefer Madeira because of its tensile strength and color fastness. I use Madeira and I'm genuinely impressed by its consistent quality. You'll love it too. I'm so glad that you could join me. I'm Nancy Zieman. Welcome to Sewing with Nancy. This is my third program in this series, the Ultimate Serger Answer Guide. Serger author and expert Gail Brown is here once again to share her serging savvy with us. Gail, let's tell our viewers what is in store for them today.
Today we're going to talk about taking the confusion out of using decorative threads. We're going to talk about coordinating their fabric to the decorative thread and also some time-saving tricks for use and stitching.
Here are some of the fascinating special effects that decorative threads can produce. I know that you'll enjoy seeing the practical tips and inspiring projects. That's what's coming up next on Sewing with Nancy. Throughout this series on the Ultimate Serger Answer Guide, we've kind of posed some questions that are frequently asked of serger experts and then giving you the answers to them. The first question today we're going to work with is, so often when we have baskets of decorative thread, how do you know which thread to use? How do you recommend, Gail, for sewers and sergers to start?
Well, first of all, I like to buy threads that are sold with sewing and serging notions because the put-ups are large enough and they are smooth enough to feed through the serger. And generally I start with a smoother, finer, higher twisted thread and then graduate up to heavier threads.
Now we can put quite heavy threads in the loopers because the loopers do not go through the fabric, they knit around the edge. So we test first to see if the threads fit through the eyes of the looper.
Yes, and what I've done here, Nancy, is I've taken woolly nylon thread, I've put it through my guides, but how do I get that limp thread through the eye of my upper looper? And what I've done is just made a loop of regular sewing thread, and then I've placed the woolly nylon thread in it, and notice how I just pull that through. Isn't that easy?
It's a great cradle.
And it just, the thread cradle pulls it through, and I know because it goes through double thickness or two strands that it will feed smoothly through the serger.
So even before sometimes you choose on the final project, try threading it first, and that will for sure tell you if you're going to have serging problems later on. Another threading idea is to work with a needle or looper threader that's a wire. And I'm simply going to, you can do this through the eye of the needle, put the pointed end through the eye. Let's see if I can be steady and do this. And then again, like you did through the cradle, insert the thread through the opening. And then just keep advancing that threader through the eye area and tug it through. And you may not think you need this type of threading help through the eye, but because a serger has so many of the mechanicals in the front and the needle area, it sometimes is helpful to have a little extra helping aid here.
Definitely. And remember, Nancy, that the needle is not going to show as much as the loopers, which we showed.
Yes.
So
now we're going to start with some threads, some guidelines as to work with the decorative threads in this section, but some of the easiest decorative threads first.
Nancy, the pillow you're showing uses top stitching, buttonhole twist, button and carpet thread, which is one of the easiest to use in all positions.
We have it here, the upper looper, lower looper, and even the needle.
And I have a sample of it here, Nancy. Part of the reason it's so easy to serge is because it has that high twist for smooth feeding.
It's easy to find, it's washable, and easy to serge with.
Yes.
One of my other favorites to begin with is to just work with Rayon Thread. We've used Rayon Thread on many Sewing with Nancy programs, but generally when working with a traditional sewing machine, The reason I like rayon thread, or to suggest it, is it's multi-purpose. You just don't have to use it on your serger. It can be in different put-ups, and sometimes for serging I buy the larger put-ups because we use more yardage with a serger. Give us your ratio that you'd like to use.
Generally, the ratio we use, Nancy, is for every inch, you're going to multiply that by 10, so you need 10 inches for every inch of decorative serging. And I allow a little bit more if you're a beginner for testing.
Yeah, that's right. Here you can see that we've combined rayon threads in the loopers to blend colors and enhance the coverage of the collar and lapel area of this jacket. It was fun to choose different colors of rayon thread, and I'd like to show you how we did that. The key was to blend the threads rather than just use one thread. Sometimes you can't get a great match. You can blend them by using 2, 3, or up to 4, as we have in this instance, of thread going through both the loopers, both the upper looper and the lower looper. And what I just showed you was a palette to hold the various spools of threads. We have them threaded through the tension guides as one. Notice we have 4 threads here. Not recommended for the needle, but for the loopers.
Yes, and you get the added weight plus the blending of the color, either for contrast or for matching.
And that wool suit that we showed you, plus the small little sample I'm working with an overlock stitch, just the basic stitch. We can just get such an interesting thread colors to match the fabric, and you couldn't do that by just working with one thread color. By blending it, it's really quite fun. So these are some guidelines if you want to start to work with decorative stitches. Start with the easiest, high twist thread, and then work with the rayon threads and consider blending them. This pillow showcases a heavier weight of rayon thread where you have it in the upper looper and lower looper around the edges, and then a unique chaining stitch to create this fun tassel to give this pillow a really great home decorating look. Gail, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about heavier rayon thread?
The heavy rayon thread we're showing, Nancy, has a medium twist, so there's more loft than you would get with a high twist thread. But what that also means is that you are going to have to lengthen your stitch length to accommodate the wider diameter. And the other thing that I've done is that I've loosened my upper and lower looper to accommodate and allow it to pass through the machine, which you have to do with any thread. And if it's really thick, we might even have to bypass these tension dials by putting a piece of tape over the top.
Sure.
The other thing that I've done to make them feed smoothly is by using my spool caps here. And then as you can see, as I stitch, I've used the longer length, and if you're in doubt, start with a longer length and then you won't get a jam up. And then I serge, and you've got great coverage on that edge with the rayon thread in all positions.
We'll also use this information as we go further for some of the metallic heavier weights. So a lot of this information can apply later too. The fringe can be worked with the heavier weight, or I'm going to use that same setup that I had earlier with the thread blending. I'm just going to serge on air. Just serge and serge. This really uses a lot of yardage. It's kind of fun to create. As you can see, as I gather this into place, it's kind of an interesting tassel. You have to do a little more work, a little more serging, but it's kind of fun to work with.
And didn't you seal the ends with seam sealant?
Yes, with a seam sealing, put a drop on the end so they don't fray, and then cut it after it is dried. We've worked with rolled edges throughout this series, and we'd like to go a little bit further into rolled edges for greater coverage. On the sock edges, you can see this is very dense coverage, a little airier look, and we'd perhaps like the denser coverage. And you can look for threads that are thicker than the others. This type of stretch nylon thread is the traditional one we had earlier in this series. This one is about 3 times the width, and I would recommend using this in the upper looper, the one that has the more thread coverage, the more visibility. You know, one of the other questions that we get asked a lot, Gail, is if we have a problem with stitch irregularity. That happens, we're called little hiccups.
Yes. Decorative stitch irregularities, such as the hiccups on the top blue sample, indicate irregular feeding of the looper threads. Solve hiccups with our simple strategies and your stitch will be uniform throughout, such as on the second blue sample.
Now you're going to check for, of course, the thread paths first of all.
Whenever I have irregular stitching or hiccups, that's the first thing I do, Nancy. I make sure that all the threads are flowing freely through the machine and through all the guides that are indicated by the color coding. The other thing that I do is I make sure my telescopic thread guide is all the way up. And I like the new notion, the sponge thread pads that keep the cone and spool from spinning on the thread rods. The other tip from my co-author is if you're still having problems, narrow and lengthen your stitch slightly to avoid those hiccups.
We have another way to solve problems with stitch irregularity, and you can see it on this garment. This beautiful wrapped edge on the mohair garment, again created by Linda Lee, exposes only the upper looper thread, and this is a great way to prevent the irregularities by using this wrap stitch. Gail will show you how to adjust the tensions for wrapping.
Nancy, all I did is I kept all my other width wide and my length the same, but I tightened down my lower looper so you couldn't see it, much like what we did when we did the rolled edge.
Right.
But you have the wide, so your upper looper completely wraps the edge. And I have a contrasting sample and a blended sample here. And the nice thing about this is you don't have to worry as much about stitch irregularities because they don't interlock at the edge. So just tighten down that lower looper to get the wrap stitch.
And then you widen the width.
Yes,
Just
it
as a
should be
quick
the full width.
And then that upper looper can be at the maybe a little looser setting to wrap.
Yes, in fact, you want it very loose and go to tighter. It's better to start that way because then you won't get the jam-ups again.
You know, in working with serging, there are 3 basic stitches, the overlock, the rolled, and the flatlock, and now we've added this kind of fourth, the wrap stitch, just by changing the tensions. You really can't be afraid to change these dials as you're serging or sewing, and so keep that in mind. They're meant to be changed. So often in the sewing machine we don't change them, but here we need to do that. Next we'll have some more ideas for you. Our next question, how to use yarn successfully and safely for serging. These patriotic napkins have a homespun flavor. The needle punch yarn on cones was responsible for this interesting look. Here's the easy setup. We're discussing working with decorative yarns through this series, and now I'm going to show you a little bit more about yarns. We can put these in the upper looper and the lower looper, but it can't be knitting yarn because many times that's too heavy. It has to be able to fit comfortably and safely through the eye of the loopers. This setup, using a needle punch or a successful type of yarn, was placed around the very edge of this napkin. Now I have this double eye needle threaded with the end of the thread tail to show you how to weave it back through the stitching, through the serging. Rather than just clipping it off or using a seam sealant and clipping it off, this is a little bit safer way with these decorative yarns. And now you can do some clipping if you'd like. In addition to working on a napkin edge or home decorating project, you may also want to consider it for an edge on polar fleece or lofty fleeces where you need the texture of the yarn to blend in with the fabric. This is what we used in this instance. It's kind of fun. Again, either can be a rolled edge or overlock stitch as in this area, or even could be a flatlock setup. It's a versatile type of decorative yarn. Another question we get asked frequently is, what about rayon thread? I have some breakage of rayon thread. We've used rayon thread in the sewing machine series as well as in Serger series, and when working with this, the key is the needle. New needles are probably the most important factor for sewing and serging. Use a comparable type needle for the thread. On this top, you can see that the metallics and the rayon threads have been blended together to give luster to go along with the lame fabrics. The rayons and metallic threads are very easy to use in this area, providing you use the right needle. Again, check your owner's manual, but if you can use the same type of needle on your serger as you can on your sewing machine, it makes it a lot easier. Another question, and that is, I have decorative threads, but I can't get the tension to be balanced. When working with heavyweight decorative threads, as in this type of thread that has metallic and rayon in it, it's very full thread, full-bodied thread. Always test on a sample, lengthen the stitch, and loosen the loopers. Very common settings. It's easy to work with this thread for interesting patchwork. Linda Lee, one of our contributing seamstresses for this series, made this top, and you can see it has a lot of glamour to it because of this choice of the threads and fabrics. Think about using serger thread for quilting. We used it in the first program of this series for just basic seaming, but for decorative stitching, I've started to piece together some fabrics using a flatlock stitch and this decorative metallic thread, placing wrong sides together rather than right sides together. serging along the edge, again the flatlock stitch as we did in the second program of this series. And you would serge many strips together. I'm just going to do one to show you. But when you pull it up and flatten it out, it has a very interesting quilting look, adding a nice new dimension. The next problem I'd like to address is when you have twisting of yarns or heavy decorative threads in your serger. The solution is to use a horizontal guide to place the spools into place. By having the spools horizontal with this ribbon-like accessory thread, when you serge, it evenly feeds, preventing little hiccups or twisted of the yarns. A simple solution. So just snap those on your spool spindles for even feeding. Throughout this series, we've been addressing problems with serging, or maybe little confusions you may have had, and giving you general advice on how to adjust the tensions, change the spools, etc. But probably the most important suggestion is to just look at your serger to see how the thread is going through the dials and the tensions and through all the passages. Because if the thread is not going through the tensions properly, often it can just snap right out. You're obviously going to have improper stitch formation. Give your thread a little love tug if it's not serging properly to make sure that the thread is in the tension guide. Then double check that you have it threaded in proper order. I many times put these little decals on my serger just to know which is the upper looper, which is a lower looper. We don't serge daily for many of us, and we need to make sure that we have everything going through the right path. It's great to have these little guidelines, reassurances. Checking your owner's manual is a good thing at this point to make certain that the thread is following the correct path. I so often, especially with the loopers and decorative threads, have found that the thread snaps out or comes out of the proper thread passage. We talk about loopers a lot in this series, and there are two loopers on this machine, an upper looper and lower looper. The upper looper has the purple thread, passes the thread over the fabric. The lower looper passes the thread under the fabric, has the red thread in it in this instance. Sometimes burrs occur anywhere around the looper pieces because of nicks with the needle, with serging with different fabrics, and the nicks will cause improper stitch balance. Take it to your local sewing machine dealer. They'll change it for you, and you'll have improved loopers. Speaking of sewing machine dealer, I have my serger tuned up once a year, just like you do with your car periodically, and it will improve the life and your stitching frustration, trust me. We've looked at all these areas, and now we're right in the middle here. We need to clean it, because cutting off the excess fabric, you're going to get lots of lint. Ways of handling this with brushes to brush it out. A canned air that's ozone friendly is extremely important, or an attachment that goes on your vacuum cleaner that can remove all the lint from the small places. And this is what I use very frequently. The throat plate is what I'd like to look at next. Many times I pop that out periodically and dust lint out, remove the lint. And when you look at the stitch fingers, because sometimes these will burr. This is called a crocus cloth. It's a denim fabric that has some fine filaments impregnated in it so that you can kind of sand off any sections. Just a little bit will go a long way if you have some burrs or nicks. It's not a foolproof way of making sure the burrs are gone, but it certainly will sand things down quite nicely. So these are some kind of interesting ways of taking care of your serger. Another one is to clean out the lint from the tension discs. I don't have any thread in my right needle right now, so I just have a cotton fabric, and I'm going to swab it through the tension disc just the way the thread goes through. And then change the needles. I mentioned this earlier, but a new needle with each project. Think of the number of times that needle goes up and down in the fabric. It wears out quickly. So do change that with every new project. It's time to wrap up this series on the Ultimate Serger Answer Guide, but before I do, I'd like to take time to thank our special guest, Gail Brown. Gail, it's been a pleasure to have you back again.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here, and I certainly hope our easy solutions lead our viewers to more enjoyable serging.
You know, we've given many ideas today, or answers, and they're all in Gail's book that she's co-authored, so make certain that you refer to this when working at your serger. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.
Sewing with Nancy has been brought to you in part by PFAFF, simply the best European line of sewing machines. Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears. Oxmoor House, publishers of sewing, quilting, and craft books. Madeira Threads, designed for home and professional embroiderers everywhere. And by Nancy's Notions Sewing Catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and notions.